Howdy, howdy, and welcome to part 4. Um, I'm recording this, and the last part hasn't even gone up yet. I've been having a lot of fun reading these lately, so, yeah, just thought, why not? Screw it. Yeah, part 4. I have nothing to say, it's too important, so we're just gonna hop right into it. Let's go. Back in Nazunoyuki, whilst Kome was trying to explain to Emiko the intricacies of her plan to save Midori Suzumiya, Hyoka and Junji had wandered off to explore the town. It was a quaint little place, and the two had even talked about moving someday. Already I'm flubbing. And the two had even talked a little about moving here someday, when Junji was an old man, to live out his final years and maybe even be able to join Hyoka in the afterlife. As they joked around and tossed a few snowballs lightly at some of the trees, a shrill shrieking sound came from a nearby house, an unmistakable yowling of a cat. This cat, though, sounded either humongous or was in a lot of pain to put out a cry of that volume. They rushed to the door of the dwelling where the howl had come from, and Junji knocked on it firmly. "Hey, is everything okay in there?" he called. "We heard some loud noises," and he was cut off by the sound of the door unlocking. Just a minute," came an oddly familiar yet muffled voice from behind it. Hyoka knew that voice. That southern drawl was unmistakable, but how could it be? "There we go," sighed a red-faced Lydia, opening the door. Immediately, the couple were assailed by the smells of sweat, booze, and other things. Lydia herself was in a state of near undress, wearing only a large bath towel over her surprisingly ripped body. "Hyoka! What are you doing here? Wait, is everything all right back at base? Did Cecily send you?" Calm down, ma'am," said Junji, diverting his gaze away from the clearly caught mid-coitus cat girl. "Everything is fine, I think. We just came by because we heard a cat howl. Is there a cat here?" Lydia laughed awkwardly and bapped Junji in the face with her violet tail. "Well, present company excluded, no. But that begs the question. Why are you two here? Hyoka, care to report?" Yes, let me explain," fumbled the Yukiona. As quick as she could, she explained the situation at hand to Lydia. The initial attack on Emiko and Rei, the burning of Emiko's apartment by the creature, its second assault on her, and the necessity to seek Kome's counsel for guidance. When she was done, Lydia's head was practically swimming. Being in heat at the moment, she already had a hard time focusing on any given matter at hand. Combine that with Hyoka's fast talk and leaving out key details momentarily, only to come back minutes later to add them in, was almost too much for her addled brain to handle. That is... Well, that's a lot to take in," she said, rubbing her temples. "Give me a few minutes to get dressed and I'll come by. My husband could honestly probably use the break anyhow." Closing the door, Lydia sighed. Her job had found its way to her yet again somehow. Nuzzling the heavily scratched and clawed-up man in the room with her, she quickly threw on some light clothes and made her way back out. Normally, she would have worn something warmer, but for a nekomata in heat, clothes became nearly unbearable to wear. Thus Lydia's need for something light that would barely touch her. Though, in all honesty, she would have much preferred to go nude if she could have. The trek back to the mansion was simple enough, and when they arrived, Emiko was just as surprised to see Lydia as she'd been to see Hyoka and Junji. "Ma'am, how did you get here? When did you get here?" "I've been here, for a few days," she replied, unconsciously scratching at her torso. came here with my husband to, well, it's not important right now. Hyoko explained to me, but I'm afraid I still don't quite understand. Emiko nodded, and for the next few minutes, the Oni filled her boss in on the details Hyoko had missed or had confused. Speaking of confused, when Emiko mentioned Cryptid Ranger Blue to her, Lydia's brow furrowed. "There is no Cryptid Ranger Blue," she replied. "Red, green, yellow, and black are, or were, here, and gold is back in America, holding down the fort, so to speak." "You said her name was—" "Megami Toriyama," answered Emiko, offering, "Perhaps she's new? You're not exactly in charge of the West Coast branch, ma'am. Could be she slipped under your radar." "Yes, I suppose it's possible," said Lydia, dropping the subject for the time being. In the future, when she had more time, she'd definitely look into this Megami a little more. Something about her just didn't sit right with Lydia's feline seventh sense. "So, what's the plan you two are coming up with to deal with Suzumiya, and why do I feel like it's going to give me a headache?" Komei glanced at Emiko knowingly, and the brunette replied, "Well, we need to get a hold of the staff of Anubis and give it to her, for one." "Why am I not surprised?" sighed Lydia. "Yeah, that's not gonna happen. You need to think of something else. I'm sorry. That is a risk I cannot allow to be taken under any circumstance." Lydia bent down to look the seated Emiko in the eyes. I understand you want to save this girl, Emiko. You want to make things right, fix what you did. We're forced to do. But sometimes things just don't work out that way. It hurts. Believe me, I've been there. Maybe not to this extent, but I have been there. It's time to start planning how you'll defeat her. Komei nodded in agreement. "Emiko, the odds of our original self returning are, well, it isn't unheard of. It usually requires extraordinary circumstances. I hate to say it, but your Nikomata friend is right. It may be easier to defeat her and send her soul to the afterlife that way than it would be to try and reach her." Emiko could feel her emotions rising, bubbling to the surface like a witch's brew, and her fists began to shake. Anger, rage at herself for being so weak, as well as a powerful hatred for those who had controlled her and forced her to kill. Despair, for she knew deep down that Lydia and Komei were correct. She would have to confront Midori and strike her down once more. Pain, in knowing that she would essentially have to kill this girl a second time. An innocent girl whose life was taken by Emiko's claws once already. It was quickly becoming too much for the Oni princess to bear, and she stood up sharply, nearly flipping the table with her legs as she did. "I'm going for a walk," she declared, covering the shakiness in her voice with affected royal decorum. "I need time to consider every option. Don't follow me." And with that, she stormed off, leaving Lydia feeling more than just a little guilty. As if sensing this, Komei approached her and laid a reassuring hand on the cat girl's shoulder. "You did the right thing, dearie," she sighed. "It may not be what the girl wants to hear, but in the end, it may well be what she needs to. I suppose only time will tell." "Yeah," sighed Lydia, hit by a wave of soberness so strong it knocked the heat out of her, and she turned to Hyoko. "I think my husband and I will be heading back to Fumizaki with y'all, if that's okay. I believe Emiko may need all the support she can get." Outside, Emiko trudged through the snow, the crunch of it beneath her feet acting as a slight balm on the burning fury raging through her at the moment. She didn't want to believe that what Lydia was telling her, that she'd have to kill Midori again, but on some level she'd understood it was necessary. The truth was that she'd come all the way here to find a way to slay her anyway, after all, Emiko tried telling herself. Why should her mission change now just because she learned its name? Even as that thought creeped into her head, Emmy banished it. No, that wasn't the kind of person she was. Was it? Could she really bring herself to do this? Now when she knew who her pursuer was and why she dogged her so? Noticing a brook running through the town, she decided to take a seat by it and allowed the soothing sounds of crisp running water to calm her down. Eyes closed, she lay back and allowed herself to tune everything but the sounds of the water out. She stayed like this for several minutes, laying there motionless, until she sensed a slight change in the light through her azure eyelids. Opening them, she beheld what seemed at first glance to be a penguin chick, only a bit larger than average. When it opened its beak to speak, Emmy realized it must have been the child of the were-penguins they met earlier. "You sad?" it chirped inquisitively. "Miss Gunga, who are you?" The moment Ava Twitter has been waiting for. Emiko blinked and couldn't help but smile at the little critter. "I'm Emiko," she replied, using her human name as opposed to her real one, as it would be much easier for the little guy to say. "And yes, I suppose I am. I hurt someone I didn't mean to, and I don't know how to make it right with them." Skunga waddled closer before hunkering down next to Emmy. Such a brave little penguin, she thought, to have no fear of a big, scary Oni lying there in the snow. "Big words, not no," he said. "But it hurt, friend. So sorry. Give present. Skunga Mama and Dada tell Skunga if you ever make friends sad, give them big pebble to make happy." While Emiko doubted a pebble would be the solution to her problem, the little penguin had given her an idea. True, she couldn't just allow herself to be killed by Midori, but if she used a powerful illusion to make it seem like she'd been killed, perhaps, or in other words, give her a present. "Skunga, you're a genius," grinned Emiko. "Here, take this. Thank you. Here, have this. It's a gift." She reached into her purse and pulled out a rock, smooth and blue. "Oh, what a rock!" said an enraptured Skunga, taking the stone in his small flipper. "You're good friend. Me hope you have good luck." Standing back up and brushing the snow off of her back, Emiko waved goodbye to the little penguin before beginning the brief trek back to the manor, a somewhat elaborative plan already forming in her mind. Sorry for the coughing, by the way. In New Atlantis, meanwhile, Usoko and Kuriko were working hard on studying the ancient text that Quezakan had provided them. Immediately after giving Kuriko her yokai crystal, the Thunderbird had taken the sisters to her secret library beneath her meager dwelling, where she kept many hundreds of tomes and texts unseen by mammalian eyes for centuries. Though Usoko wanted very much to expand her knowledge with the esoteric literature surrounding her, she knew she needed to devote every available second to learning the techniques she needed. For the past 2 days, she'd been instructing Kuriko on the use of her new powers, as Nonami once had for her, and Usoko had to admit her little sister was something of a natural. She was able to pick up spells and abilities in minutes or hours that had taken Usoko days. Not that Usoko was at all envious of this, far from it. If anything, it was actually quite encouraging. If Kuriko was having this much ease now, then perhaps she could be the one to master the revival technique needed to awaken Tatsuya. While Usako certainly wanted to be the one to revive their mother, she supposed it ultimately didn't matter who did, so long as she came back, and so the two Takibanas trained under the watchful eyes of Quezakan and Elizabeth. It was Elizabeth who first noticed something odd when Usako began practicing the revival technique. Her hair would briefly shimmer, and the wings on her back seemed to change? She couldn't be absolutely certain, but for brief moments, something about Usako changed, and it made the Dhampir uneasy. She hoped it was just her imagination and not something dangerous, either to herself or to Usako, who, she had to admit, was starting to grow on her. Like a moss. Speaking of dangerous, some disturbing news had begun spreading around the city. Bodies were being found drained of all fluids, leaving behind only desiccated sacks of skin and bone, with no obvious signs of what caused it. If it were an arachne or some other predatory fluid sucker, there would be telltale signs like puncture wounds or webbing. But as far as any of the morticians could tell, these bodies were simply sucked dry. The only thing each one had in common was an amount of dead leaves and pieces of bark in the area where the bodies were found. Excuse me. While yes, surface trees did exist in decent quantity to help supply air, they were kept leafed year-round through magical means, and as such, only rarely would some leaves die and fall off. As well, the leaves were elm leaves. All the surface world trees in New Atlantis were maple trees. One day, while the two sisters were taking a break from their studies to wander the city for a bit, Usako ran into an old familiar face. Murphy, the gill man. He had been a security guard at Gardena, partnered with a kappa named Josuke, but when an enraged Gohan had escaped and created a breakout crisis, Murphy had gotten his arm ripped off by a hellhound and fled into the sewers where he met Usako and company, and the Pinkette regenerated his lost arm. He later found out that Josuke had been killed by a Death Stalker, and as such Murphy had retired, unable to reconcile that his own cowardness had cost his friend his life. It would seem that retirement had been treating the old gill man well, as his lost arm had more or less grown back fully now. Only a small seam where it had been severed, and a clear paler pigmentation in it signifying its lack of sunlight compared to the rest of him. Alright, another water trick here. Oh.
Usako, long time no see.
Oh, damn it, hold on.
Usako, long time no see.
He gargled.
How's Ray? I know she was hit pretty hard by, well,
Getting better at that. Josuke had been a close friend of Ray's from a young age, and to say the Red Oni had taken his death well would have been an understatement. Hey, Mr. Murphy, smiled Usako. Ray's doing pretty good. Pretty much back to normal now. Good to see you too, by the way. How's the new arm been treating you?
I can't complain, shrugged Murphy. Except when there's a storm overhead, but otherwise it's about as good as the old one. Thanks again, by the way. Who's the kid?
That wasn't as good. Usako glanced to Kuriko, motioning her over. This is my sister, Kuriko. We're on a learning expedition here. Speaking of, what's that? She pointed to the large pale green tower in the center of the city, which stretched up to the top of the dome itself, from which the bubble seemed to emerge.
That's the Orichalcum Tower,
replied Murphy reverently.
Our most sacred of structures, given to us by Poseidon himself, or so the old legends say. On its surface is etched the laws mighty Poseidon passed down to the first mermen and gillmen ages ago. Would you like to get a closer look?
Both girls' eyes sparkled. Would we ever? Cheered Kuriko. The walk to the tower was a long one, but made bearable by Murphy telling the girls all about the history of both Atlantises, old and new. The original Atlantis may have been sunken by the Ovirus, he explained, but it was also due in part to the hubris of its builders. It had been constructed over a massive undersea lake, and as such, when its foundations had begun to crumble under the Ovirus's onslaught, the city stood no chance. Very little had been salvaged from it, the main object of importance being the tower and a few relics from the old king's palace. Upon their arrival, Murphy was surprised to note that the place was conspicuously empty. The area surrounding the base of the tower was set up like a park, with fountains and benches for people to sit on.
Weird. Normally this time of day there's lots of folks here,
commented Murphy.
Where could they all be?
A loud ursine roar echoed through the area, alerting the group to the likely source of the park's abandonment, as they witnessed a massive grizzly bear come lumbering from behind the tower, snarling with a crazed look in its eyes. Is that a bear? Yelled Kuriko. How did a bear get here? Less talking, more fighting, called Usoko, taking a defensive stance in front of Kuriko and Murphy. Yogi here is mine. I can handle this. You two get clear, okay? Not waiting around for confirmation, Usoko summoned her bat and began circling the bear warily, expanding her still injured wings as a show of intimidation. She might not be able to fly right now, but she could make herself look big and hopefully scare it off. That theory was soundly put to bed when the beast began charging at her, a maw full of deadly, dagger-like teeth, ready to close on any part of her it could latch onto. As it got closer, Usoko could see a strange green glint in the bear's eye. Someone or something had enthralled it to do their bidding. Still, she had to defend herself, and at the last possible second she swung, the bat striking perfectly into the bear's mouth, and, thanks to Usoko's magically enhanced strength, was sent tumbling backwards, striking a hard wall and dissipating into fog. What? What? Muttered Usoko, rushing over to where the bear had just been, expecting to find some evidence it had been there, and finding none. No blood, no fur, only a smell like wet fur and salmon breath marked the great beast's presence. And somewhere, deep in an Alaskan forest, one particularly confused grizzly bear with a sore jaw began trotting slowly back to its den. It had had enough excitement for one day. Back with Usoko, and both Takibanas were magically scouring the area, hoping to find some trace of whatever had called the bear to this place. It was Kuriko who first noticed a small pile of elm leaves behind the pillar, near where the bear had first appeared. Sis, look! She called over to Usoko, who came over to investigate as well. Elm leaves, and just like those bodies. You don't think there's a connection, do you? Usoko sighed, pondering for a minute. Last year, she would have never dreamed of there being a connection, even in the odd circumstances. Now, though, yeah, knowing how weird things could be, there might well be a connection. Something may be, I don't know, draining the gillmen, she formulated, and it can summon bears, maybe? I mean, how else does a bear get here? Some sort of plant creature, maybe. Her train of thought was cut off by the sound of Murphy crying out suddenly. Without a second thought, the sisters rushed over to see a sight most disturbing. Murphy, in the grasp of what could only be described as a woman made of a tree, with branches shaped into limbs, a chest, head, and everything else. Within her body glowed an ephemeral green light, which exited through gaps all throughout her body. The face was twisted into a sadistic smirk as one of its gnarled hands was gripping Murphy tightly and clearly draining his life force from him. Acting on instinct, Usoko flung her bat at the creature's arm. The force, combined with Usoko's not unimpressive strength, caused the wood comprising it to shatter like balsa into splinters. In the same movement, Usoko ran over and heaved the weakened Murphy onto her back and began running, Kuroko following suit and helping pick up some of the burden when she caught up to them. From behind them, the sisters could hear the tree thing hiss in rage and begin to chase after them. Though fortunately, even with 200 pounds of Gillman between them, the thing's wooden body made it slower than the Takibanas. "What the hell was that?" gasped Usoko once they'd outpaced the thing, hiding in an alleyway. She'd taken advantage of the free moment to swap back into her combat form. "I've never seen anything like it." Let me try that read again. "I've never seen anything like it." Ugh, that was still a bad read. "I've never seen anything like it." There we go. Sorry, I'm a perfectionist sometimes. Kuriko had gone to get Murphy some water, as the thing had seemingly drained it from his body with a touch. Speaking of water. She knew they'd found their local killer, but now they had to figure out how to keep it from killing again. "I don't know," whispered Kuriko. "You're the one with all the knowledge here. You tell me." "I've never seen anything like it," repeated Usoko. "Some kind of tree woman. I don't know. I don't know. There was nothing about them or anything like it in Nonami's books." A shadow flipped down from the roof, and for a second Usoko thought the thing had found them, but it turned out to be Elizabeth, who had been trailing them as a precaution. "It's a Spriggan," she explained, "a sort of nature spirit. But something is wrong with this one. It's twisted, corrupt. Spriggans only live on dry land in deciduous forests. To find one down here, and looking as it does, is alarming. And the aura it gives off. I could be mistaken, but it feels like our Amana's." With a swing of her arm, Usoko's bat reappeared in her hand, and she brought it down to the ground. "I don't care where it came from. How do we stop it?" "That's simple enough," said Elizabeth. "To kill a tree, use fire. Or drive a copper nail into it. I don't suppose you have any copper on hand. True story. If you ever have like a tree stump in your yard, just put a copper nail into it, and that'll actually kill it. Don't know how it works, but yeah." Usoko shook her head. "I can make fire, though. Lots of it." It was Elizabeth's turn to shake her head. "Down here, your fire could set the whole atmosphere aflame and kill us all. No, we'll have to do this the hard way. Give me my size." "What? No way!" exclaimed Usoko. "I was told you don't get these till we're done." "Would you rather face this thing alone, then? Because I can certainly oblige you there." Usoko grumbled, but began rummaging through the magic bag on her side. After what felt like 10 minutes, she finally produced a pair of obsidian size, which she promptly handed to her ally. Elizabeth looked at them for a moment, like someone who was seeing a friend for the first time in years, and took them in her hands. After a few practice swings, she put them into her belt and turned to Kuriko. "Kid, this is going to get dangerous. Take the Gillman to a safe place and get back to the villa. If we're not back in an hour, call HQ and tell them we're dead." Kuriko's eyes went wide, and she began spluttering in protest, but Usoko held up a hand. "Listen to her, Kuro. Mina is right. We don't know what we're up against here. Get Mr. Murphy to safety and run. One of us needs to survive this. I love you, sis. Now go." The two girls walked out of the alley, leaving a bleary-eyed Kuriko to do as she was bade. A teary-eyed Kuriko to do as she was bade, albeit reluctantly. As she looked back once more, she couldn't help but feel a little impressed by how badass her sister looked in that armor. But why did her main weapon have to be that goofy bat? "So what's the plan, Liz?" asked Usoko as the two emerged from the alley, the pinkette finally dropping the code name. "Much as I'd rather not, I'm going to defer to your experience here." "Simple," replied Elizabeth, pulling off the denim jacket she'd been wearing and tossing it aside. "We need to lure her into a tight area, somewhere with little room to maneuver or summon more bears. Somewhere with little nature around for her to manipulate." Usako couldn't help but chuckle to herself. She'd always hated nature, and now it was coming back at her with a vengeance. The irony. Her musings were cut off as they saw the wooden figure of Spriggan stood before them, an unconscious Gilman clenched in her one good hand. Before either girl could say anything, Spriggan opened her mouth and began speaking in a raspy, creaking voice, like dead wood rubbing against dry leaves, her tone bordering gleeful.
"Wanna see me drink this guy?"
A little too sell for my take, but no. Without even giving them a chance to reply, Spriggan's arm glowed orange, and as Usako and Elizabeth watched in horror, the Gilman began to wither and shrivel away until he was nothing more than a husk. At the same time, the injuries she'd sustained from Usako's bat healed themselves, healthy greenwood forming in the place of the old arm, quickly covered by the same brown bark that made up Spriggan's skin. "I'm gonna be sick," muttered Usako, steeling herself for the fight. "Who sent you?" demanded Elizabeth, although part of her already knew the answer, or so she felt.
"I was sent here by my father, Aramanes,"
sneered Spriggan, tossing the carcass away like a used candy wrapper.
"At first the mission was simple. Take out Takibana, but keep her intact so he can possess it. But then you showed up, Elizabeth. You're supposed to be dead, but you aren't. I decided to tail you and figure out what's going on. Now that I know you've turned traitor, I'm gonna rip your guts out and feed them to my sister Manticore."
If Elizabeth was bothered by the proposition, she hardly showed it. Instead, she let out a hearty "ha!" and turned her back on the wooden woman. "It will take far more than the likes of you to bring me to my knees, Twiggy," she sneered. "I doubt you could even lay a single scratch on me. Only pathetic fools boast as you do, gloating about victory before the fight has even begun. If you're actually serious, then show me with actions. Otherwise, you're little more than childish bluster." Usako could tell that Elizabeth was intentionally trying to provoke Spriggan into anger. It was a technique Ray had tried to teach her a while back, though Usako still had a lot to learn. Still, as the Oni had once said to her, an angry enemy defeats themselves. Enraged, a foe's movements can become more predictable, and as Usako watched the opening blows of the fight, that much was obvious. Spriggan was relying on powerful swipes from incredibly sharp claws, tearing through the air, always where Elizabeth had been, and never where she was, as she seemed to flit about the battlefield at super speed. While the Dhampir knew it couldn't go on forever this way, this was also hardly the only trick she had up her metaphorical sleeve. When Spriggan had once again thrown an overextended swipe at where the speedy Elizabeth had been standing, the Dhampir used this moment to flip over Spriggan, using her momentum to launch her size into the barked backside of her enemy, rolling to the side as she hit the ground. Spriggan roared in pain, trying to pull the size out, but to no avail. Seizing on the opportunity, Usako called instead on her shotgun, firing it square at Spriggan, who used an arm to block the blast, only to scream in agony when it hit. Napalm! "Maybe I can't use fire here," grinned Usako, "but there's other ways to burn you down." Spriggan hissed and swore in a language that was old when mankind was young, and tried to wipe and scrape the napalm off of herself, but to no avail. Unfortunately, Though Usako's attack had done some damage, it had the effect of clearing Spriggan's mind somewhat. Her blows had grown more calculated now, and she was no longer swiping randomly, instead using fake-outs when possible, one of which left a sharp cut on Usako's cheek. The other successfully hit Elizabeth and sent her careening into a nearby wall and knocking her out. It was just Usoko now, and the Pinkette was mad. As Spriggan waltzed over to land a finishing blow on Elizabeth, Usoko held out her shotgun once more. "Hey, Elm Street! Catch!" "Kitty, do you mind?" Spriggan turned around just in time to be hit square in the torso with a large spread of copper shrapnel, which embedded itself deep into her and began acting as a poison to her bodily systems. With a hollow rasp, she fell over onto the ground, the green glow inside of her fading. "Oh, we did it," sighed Usoko in relief as Elizabeth slowly regained consciousness. "Indeed, that we'd best burn the body now, in case She was cut off by Kuriko, who had gotten Murphy to safety now, and seeing the fight was over, went to congratulate her sister. What happened next, though it took place in the space of a second, seemed an eternity in hindsight. Spriggan's glow returned, weaker than before, and from her back shot a thorny branch sharpened into a spear. At the same time, by sheer chance, Kuriko moved in between her sister and Spriggan, as Elizabeth watched in horror. The effect was immediate. The spear burst through Kuriko's chest, her blood splattering across Usoko's face as she beheld her own sister impaled before her. Whispered Kuriko briefly in pained confusion before the spear retracted and Spriggan stood back up, not at full power, but healing fast thanks to Kuriko's magically infused blood feeding her. Flowers began blooming from parts of her body, and the green glow changed to a deep, unnatural purple. Before the younger Takibana's body could hit the ground with a sickening thud, she was dead. For a moment, Bethany, I swear to God, your timing is horrid. For a moment, Usoko merely stood where she'd been, as if frozen. Then, with a pained, guttural scream that would echo throughout the entire sea floor, she roared in anguish as a golden beam of light burst free from her body, firing through the miles of ocean above, through the sky, and out into space, where it briefly climaxed into a faint cross shape. A cruise ship had happened to be in the area at the time, noticed it. A cruise ship, which had happened to be in the area at the time, noticed it, with many of the passengers on board wondering what it could have been, some even crying out in terror, thinking it was the end of the world. After a long moment, the light finally faded, and Usoko looked different, to say the least. Her outfit was still the same, but her weapons were gone now. She no longer needed them. Not in this form. With glowing golden hair and 2 more pairs of wings on her back, bringing the total up to 6, she looked every bit the seraphic being you think of when someone mentions angels. "You took my sister from me," she declared, looking directly at Spriggan with an expression and voice filled with every ounce of the hatred she currently felt. "Now I'm gonna take everything from you!" I did that read shit. Hold on. This is an epic. This is supposed to be like the climax line, so. "You took my sister from me. Now I'm gonna take everything from you." There we go. Before Spriggan could even get a chance to move, let alone quip, Usoko struck her. A blow to the head like 1,000 tons of stone. A sickening crack, letting her know she'd done some damage. Lashing out, the tree woman tried again and again to strike the angelic Usoko, but to no avail. She was in full control of her powers right now, and able to sense where the strikes were headed before they'd even been made. Continuing her own assault, Usoko flipped around and landed a powerhouse elbow into Spriggan's back, sending her flying. Spriggan was tired of this already, and decided enough was enough. Noticing she'd landed near Kuriko's lifeless body, she grabbed it and attempted to drain the rest of the girl's magic blood. By now, though, Elizabeth had regained her bearings enough to launch herself limply at Spriggan, taking her burning size and dragging their blades along Spriggan's arm from shoulder to wrist. Unable to keep hold while the pain seared her, she released her grip, allowing Elizabeth to grab the body and roll to safety. "Oh, no, you don't," she muttered. "Stop it!" Now far enough from the fight to get a good look at Usoko's new form, she legitimately felt a pang of fear? Yeah, definitely fear. Not necessarily for herself per se, but the sort of existential fear you get when seeing a tornado or a wildfire in the distance. This was what she'd seen glimpses of during the Pinkettes' training in the past days, when Usoko was pouring all of her focus and energy into what she was doing. This was Seraphim. Elizabeth almost felt sorry for Spriggan. Almost. "Listens now," growled Spriggan, holding her one good arm up as the other slowly regenerated. "I'm gonna finish this right here. Now fall down and bleed to death like that little shit!" Smirking, she fired a series of small, razor-sharp wooden shards straight up towards the bubble. They would never reach their target. Incinerated by a brief lance of white fire coming from Usoko's palm. "That little shit?" she asked coldly, her tone frighteningly calm, her eyes hidden behind shadow. "Do you mean my sister? The one you murdered?" It was at that moment Spriggan knew. She fucked up. Usoko raised both arms above her head, her palms outstretched, fingers spread, and began gathering energy between them. Golden light that matched her hair gathered and swirled around in the space above her palms, forming into a growing sphere the size of a basketball. "Turn to charcoal, you bark-faced bitch!" she roared, thrusting her arms down to torso level, palms spread wide to accommodate the energy blast, which fired as a golden beam of holy energy that consumed its target in its brilliance. "Divine Cannon!" Spriggan never stood a ghost of a chance, though she held her arms out as if in some vain attempt to shield herself. Her body quickly crumbled away in the maelstrom of raw, holy power. Burned first down to ash, and then even the ash was reduced to nothing. With one last impotent howl of rage still hanging in the air, the only other thing marking Spriggan's existence were the trail of bodies in her wake, and a Spriggan-shaped carbon shadow on the relatively unharmed vomitorium behind where she'd been standing seconds before. Usoko's attack, the Divine Cannon, only affected the living, while inanimate objects like buildings were left unharmed. Without even pausing for a moment to take in her victory, Usoko immediately rushed to her sister's side, healing light already pouring from her palms as she tried desperately to revive her. "Come on, please, Kuro, come back!" she cried, tears pouring down her face. "I can't lose you too!" Elizabeth watched this, knowing there was nothing that could be done at this point. Kuriko was gone, and no amount of healing magic could bring her back at this point. The pained expression on Usoko's face sent a twinge through Elizabeth, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. Remorse. "Usoko," she whispered, kneeling down and placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "She's gone. You've done all you could here. I'm sorry, but no amount of healing magic in the world can ever revive the dead. The best thing you can do is to avenge her, which you have." "She wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for me," whimpered Usoko. If I had been a better sister, she wouldn't have felt like she had to come, and none of this would have happened." A light bulb went off in Usoko's head, and she turned to Elizabeth. She's half angel, right? Like me?" "Well, yes, but I don't see how." Her eyes widened in understanding. "Usoko, you're still learning the spell. The odds of you successfully casting it right now are astronomically low." "I have to," declared Usoko, turning back to Kuriko once more. "I have to try. I owe Kuriko at least that much." Her healing magic had fixed the gaping wound in her sister's chest, but Kuriko was still very much dead, something Usoko refused to allow to remain as such. Channeling every ounce of power she had left, she funneled it in the ways Quetzalcoatl and the books had told her to, letting go of herself and pouring her will, her desire to revive Kuriko, into the girl, creating her desired reality from nothing, bending the world to her will. There was suddenly a blinding aura around them, pure prismatic white, that seemed to be coming from neither girl, but from heaven above. It was almost blinding, and filled every last corner of New Atlantis in its brilliant incandescence. In the center of Usoko's palms, which lay over the motionless body of Kuriko, holes opened akin to stigmata, through which the light was focused and amplified. As warm tears fell from Usoko's face, Elizabeth could only look on in awe. What was happening now certainly resembled descriptions of angelic revivals she'd read of in books and the like, but to actually see it in person. Even the jaded Elizabeth couldn't help but find it beautiful. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the light faded abruptly, and Usoko's hands returned to normal. For a minute, it looked like Usoko had failed, despite all that had just occurred, and the angel began to sob. Then Kuriko's chest began rising and falling once more, in small, shallow breaths. "I don't believe it," whispered Elizabeth in genuine shock, both partially relieved and a little terrified at what Usoko had managed to do. Just what in the hell are you, Takibana?" "Kuriko," whispered Usoko in relief, tears pouring down her face. "Sis, can you hear me? Are you—" Kuriko's eyes fluttered open weakly. She smiled softly, and before she lost consciousness again, she made certain to impart a special message to Usoko, one she'd been entrusted with. "Mom. Sis, hi." She then lost consciousness, still alive, but catatonic. Usoko would learn soon that Kuriko's brief brush with death had caused a degree of brain damage that was slowly healing itself, though it would take some time. Knowing they needed to return home now, Elizabeth began pulling whatever strings necessary to get the trio home immediately. It was, she felt, the least she could do. Deep in the bowels of Ahrimanabad, its namesake had been researching ways of transferring his essence into a temporary mechanical body with John, when he suddenly jerked to the side, roaring in agony and thrashing about for several minutes, as the gnome simply stepped far, far away from the angry demon. When he finally calmed down a bit, he glanced over at John and spoke.
Spriggan has been slain. I have felt it.
Oh, well, condolences, mate, replied John, at whom Aramanus shot a death glare so powerful it would have struck a lesser man dead. Or not? Aramanus stood up then, leaving the room and returning to his chamber. Though he had no use for such emotions as sadness, and felt no such thing at the passing of his spawn, the sensation of her death had rocked him to his very core. He had felt everything Spriggan had at the moment of her demise, and briefly he even saw through her eyes. That which he saw, though he wouldn't admit it to anyone, frightened him. Usoko's angelic power had increased drastically in the short time she'd had it, and he knew why as well. She was half Ovarus after all, and the two parts of her, Angel and Ovarus, were at war internally inside her. For her to possess this much power already, though, and holy power at that, she was sliding too far. She needed to be brought back towards the darker magics. For if her angel side became too prevalent in her, it could overtake her Ovarus side and seal it away, preventing Aramanus from ever possessing her, and likely spelling his own doom to be locked back in the Black Night for eternity. Unless, of course, the fools who did his bidding could actually manage to find the remaining two keys, which he sorely doubted. Okay, normally this would be, I'd probably start wrapping up, but we're pretty close to the end, so this part's just going to be a kind of longer, I think. Yeah. Because we still have to wrap up the Emiko's stuff. But anyway. Emiko's return trip to Fumizaki was uneventful, as she mostly expected, though a small part of her worried Midori would attack the train she and the others were on once they returned to the main island. She sighed a little in relief when they pulled into the station, and felt even better still when she saw Sarah there to greet her. Having Hyoka along for the fight would have been somewhat helpful, but with Sarah by her side as well, Emiko felt a surge of relief. "Top of the morning to ya, Emiko," she smiled upon seeing Emiko emerge from the train. "Hope your trip was restful enough, because your friend seems to have started causing trouble around town. No time for downtime, I'm afraid." And all her good feelings drained out of her like someone flushed the toilet. Emmy winced, and hoped that whatever Midori had done, no one had been hurt. She couldn't handle having any more innocent blood on her hands. From behind Emmy came Lydia, already in her combat outfit, a spandex bodysuit, lightly armored in the chest, stomach, knee, and shoulder regions, a pair of infrared glasses, and her handgun and throwing knives belted to her waist. Her hair, though fairly short, had been tied back to prevent it from being used as a handhold as a precaution. "Let's get going," she declared. "The sooner we can put it down, the better. Sarah, you brought the saft, correct?" Aye, nodded Sarah, her tone hesitant. "But as a spirit myself, I have to protest. Second death is a worser fate than any, and I'd really rather not subject anyone to it." "I respect how you feel about this, Sarah," replied Lydia professionally. "The hope is we won't have to use it. It's simply there in the event, well, we're left with no choice. I don't want to use it either. But if it's between Emiko or this thing, we're choosing Emiko every time. Now then, Emmy, what's your plan exactly?" In truth, Emiko still hadn't fully thought her plan out to completion yet. It was still mostly forming in her head, like a half-remembered dream, and only the first part was clear. Perhaps, she considered, that was the only part that truly mattered. We need to go to Tsushima Park. into the mountains near Hyoka's home, so as to minimize witnesses and potential collateral damage. From there, I will call her out from the mountaintop. I doubt she'll ignore it. Emiko turned to Hyoka. You don't have to fight her if it makes you uneasy, Hyoka. If you wish to sit this out, no one will think less of you for it. Hyoka frowned angrily, a rare expression on her usually sweet face.
Of course I'm going to help, Emiko,
she stated firmly.
Well, I think I have something at home that might help me focus them. See, I got a weapon on Kaiju Island.
Let's walk and talk, interrupted Lydia. I get it's important, but the longer we dilly-dally, the more danger there is for innocent people. Come on. No one was going to argue with Lydia on that, and the group began making their way towards Tsushima Park, with Junji looking more than a little nervous. True, he certainly wasn't expected to fight alongside them, but he also didn't want to leave Hyoka's side either, even knowing she couldn't be harmed in this fight. Sensing this was the reason for his apprehensive look, Hyoka took hold of his hand and smiled.
Junkun, I have an idea. Why don't you run to the house when we get there and retrieve my weapon and the crystals I found? I think one of them might be meant for Emiko. Call it women's intuition.
Junji returned the smile, and Hyoka could tell he was feeling a little better about the situation. Still, the Yuki-onna couldn't help but be worried about her friend. Emiko had fought this thing once before, and even with Rei at her side, neither girl had stood a chance. What if this time she didn't make it? Hyoka wasn't sure she could bear the thought of losing her friend. Any of her friends. Still, she knew they had some really good fighters on their side in Sarah and Lydia. With Sarah, she had nearly 900 years of combat experience to fall back on, having trained in many fighting styles, and with a wide variety of weapons over the centuries. While Lydia didn't have nearly that extensive of a repertoire of knowledge, she was certainly well learned in her own right. Having been trained by a secretive assassins guild from a young age, with later additional training from Nonami, Lydia Nakamoto was not one to be underestimated. Now as they stood on the edge of the cliff looking out over the forest below, and Fumizaki off in the near distance, they watched as Emi switched to her Shuten Doji form, cupped her hands over her mouth, and shouted with every ounce of power she could muster,
Midori! Come and fight me if you dare!
Ow.
Taking this as his cue, Junji ran off towards the house to retrieve the items Hyoka had asked for, trailed by Sarah for a short distance to make sure he didn't get ambushed by anything. So, think she heard ya? Asked the Banshee on her return. From their vantage point, they watched as a line of trees began falling, ripped from the ground by power-filled undead arms. Midori had indeed heard Emiko, and was here for bloody vengeance. She had changed since Emiko had last seen her, and it was cause for concern. The rotting, half-melted look of her skin was gone, replaced by skin that, if you ignored the gray pallor, seemed almost normal. Her hair had been washed out and had returned to its original reddish color, albeit streaked with silver. Her eyes glowed a sickly greenish teal in their sockets, and her head had been haphazardly reattached to her neck with what appeared to be barbed wire and carpeting staples. Though no one present had ever seen one, they all knew one thing was certain. Midori Suzumiya had nearly achieved lichdom, and they had to act fast. The first blow was struck by Lydia, sending 3 knives at Midori's face, though the Revenant easily blocked them, catching them in the back of her hand. What she didn't know, or expect, was that had simply been a distraction to allow Sarah to get in behind her and unleash a cyclone directly into her back, sending Midori flying into a row of trees. Midori growled wordlessly, pulling one of the trees out and hurling it at Sarah, who merely stood in one spot as it passed through her harmlessly. A confused expression crossed Midori's face for a second, and then she realized that Sarah was a spirit, roaring in anger. As she turned her attention back to Emmy, a series of gunshots rang out as Lydia fired consecrated rounds into the undead girl, who roared in pain and began to focus solely on Lydia. Fortunately for the cat girl, she was far more quick on her feet than the lump of flesh chasing her, as she began leading her deeper into the forest, with the others pursuing. As they made chase, Emiko found herself once more cursing herself for all of this, having to rely on others to fight something that was her fault to begin with. To solve her problems, she hated it. It hurt her pride as an Oni and as a princess. Finally, they reached the clearing Lydia had been leading them towards, just as Junji came running by. Hyoka raced towards him, grabbing the items. Fortunately, since Midori was too occupied by Sarah, Emmy, and Lydia, she hadn't even noticed the two of them yet. Once she was sure she had gotten far enough away, she deactivated her crystal, pulled out her special twin-barreled Glock, and took aim. Though she was still afraid of using her powers, she knew she had to push that fear down for the moment, and she fired. The twin shots, ice and water, struck Midori one after the other, the first coating her in H2O, and the second freezing it, and her. Though no one present believed it would hold for long, it gave them a few quick seconds. I'm noticing a lot of typos in this part. To catch their breath, at least for those who needed to breathe. "What now?" asked Lydia. "How long will that hold her?"
It's the middle of the day, but we're pretty high up,
replied Hyoka, her hands extended towards the icy statue.
I can use a cold aura to keep her trapped a little longer, but we have maybe 2 minutes before she's free.
One of the odd spherical crystals from Kaiju Island fell from her robe then, rolling towards Emiko, who picked it up and examined it. She could feel something akin to static electricity emanating from the yellow orb, and then in a flash it vanished. In its place, gripped firmly in the Oni's cobalt blue hand, was a warhammer. Carved from ebony wood with golden trim and thunderbolt motifs, silver spikes surrounding the business end, and feeling heavier than a boulder. It seemed to crackle with the same elemental energy as Emiko herself.
"Well, this looks fun,"
she commented as Midori partially broke free, giving Emiko the perfect opportunity to test her new toy out, which she had already named Mjolnir 2. But before that, she had to try something. "Listen to me, Midori," she stated, reverting back to human form for a moment. "You want me dead, and I can hardly blame you for it. You were slain by my claws, and for that I am sorry." Midori was nearly free now, and seemed confused by Emiko's words. "But you think by killing me, it'll even the score, and you'll have your revenge, and then what? You can pass on? Think again, Suzumiya. If you want vengeance, you damn well better go after the ones who controlled me. I wasn't myself when I killed you. Someone was in my head, directing my actions. Both Lydia and Sarah here can vouch for that. So fine, kill me if you want. But if you don't go after them too, you're no better than a mindless animal. And I know you're better than that." Finally, Suzumiya burst free and rushed at Emiko, fist pulled back to land a crippling blow to the Oni's face, but then, mere inches from striking, she froze. Not through any power of Hyoka's this time, but her own body stopped. She stayed that way for several seconds, as it seemed she was processing what Emiko had said to her. It almost seemed like she believed her, that Midori was regaining her senses. It was then that Gohan, having heard the commotion in his forest, came storming out of the trees, enraged, and landed a powerful Yeti blow to Midori, who screamed in rage, striking him hard in the gut, putting the Yeti on his knees with one blow. "Liar!" snapped Midori, her whole body now glowing with the same green glow her eyes had been. "Oh no," whispered Lydia in actual fear. She's becoming a lich!" Midori's skin seemed to change again, becoming tighter around the bones of her body. The wire and the staples in her neck popped or fell out, and the seam began to seal itself, leaving a jagged scar. The sky above began darkening, storm clouds forming overhead which lashed out with lightning bolts and driving rain. "Die, Emiko!" she screamed, her voice now a shrieking roar. Emiko barely managed to roll out of the way in time as one of the bolts came crashing towards her. As she rolled, however, she briefly noted that the energy from the lightning seemed to funnel into her hammer rather than into the ground, and it began crackling. She didn't have too much time to ponder this, as the newly born lich came rushing at her, ebon talons reaching out towards Emiko's throat. Thinking fast, and recalling something Steve had taught her on Kaiju Island, Emiko sent a wave of high-voltage energy through her body, so that when Midori made contact, she was fed 50,000 volts of electricity, which sent her careening into the ground, stunned, but hardly out of the fight. "Listen to me!" roared Emiko over the wind and rain. "We weren't trying to trick you, I swear!"
"You need to listen to her," shouted Hyoka in agreement. "Gohan was acting on instinct. That was just poor timing. Please, we don't want to hurt you."
Lydia and Sarah had circled around Midori now, the latter of whom had her scythe gripped tight in her hands, a look of regret on her face. She didn't want to do what she was about to, but it had to be done. Hyoka noticed her, though, and sent an ice beam at Sarah's hands, freezing them. The Banshee stared down in shock, and Hyoka rushed over.
"I'm sorry, Sarah-san," she cried. "I can't let you do that. Forgive me. I know Emmy can reach her. I just feel it."
"Lass, you just..." Sarah started, and then had an idea. "Hyoka, take the talisman from me pocket and sneak it onto Midori somehow. The rest'll work itself out." A little confused, but not one to ignore her friend's request, Hyoka did as she'd been told. Once the talisman was in her hand, she phased invisible and made her way over to where Emmy, at her fullest power, and Midori were grappling, neither budging an inch. It was a simple matter to tuck the talisman into a fold in Midori's ragged clothes, and soon Hyoka was back at Sarah's side.
"What now?"
she asked. "Now," replied Sarah, "we trust in Emiko. The talisman reveals the truth, and its power works for anyone unlike the others. So long as Midori is in physical contact with it, she'll hear the truth and know it to be so. At least, as long as she's got any sense left." Hyoka nodded and turned to Emiko, cupping her hands over her mouth and yelling as loud as her quiet voice allowed.
"Emmy, try getting to her once more."
Emmy was a little befuddled by Hyoka's words, but trusted her teammate, her friend, and so tried once more. "Midori, I am not your enemy," she declared firmly, looking the lich directly in the eyes as the ever-growing storm raged and battered them. "I was under control of a group who want nothing more than total anarchy, death and destruction. They want monsters to kill humans. They made me do it, and there hasn't been a day that's passed where I haven't wept about what I was forced to do to you." Tears, both mournful and angry, began streaming down Emiko's face, though with all the rain you'd have never been able to tell. "Killing me won't bring you back, won't change the past, but together we can save the future. Please put aside your hate. Let's make amends. What do you say?" To emphasize her words, Emiko dropped her guard once more, leaping back to be out of direct reach, and raised her arms above her head. "You can either kill me here..." Wait, try that again, sorry. To emphasize her words, dropped her guard once more, leaping back to be out of direct reach, and changed to her regular Oni form, raising her arms above her head. "You can either kill me here, or we can work together. It's your choice." Midori paused. Everyone could tell she was contemplating Emiko's words. though no one but Sarah and Hyoka knew why. Then, as suddenly as it started, the dark clouds above faded and dispersed, giving way to the afternoon sun once more. Midori, her original self, or most of it anyway, had come through in the end, had heard Emiko's words, and thanks to Sarah's talisman, she'd known they were true. She fell to her knees, sobbing as Emiko knelt down to lay a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, Midori. Let it all out," she said soothingly. "You're safe now. You're safe." So it was that Midori Suzumiya returned, if not to life, then to this plane at least. The anger, the burning rage that had fueled her revival was mostly abated, save for the embers which flickered now not towards Emmy, but to the ones she'd soon learn of who controlled her. They would give Midori a place to stay at Gardner for now, until they could figure out a place for her. Someone mentioned Cryptid Ranger, and that they might be able to use her help. After all, having a super powerful lich on your side is certainly a boon. And it would be a wise idea to keep her and Emiko separate for now, added Lydia, just in case she suffers any relapses. By the time Nonami returned to Japan, everyone had already learned of Kuriko's fate from Usoko, who had returned to normal now. Nonami didn't enjoy the idea of leaving her sister behind as she was, but she knew Usoko needed her more right now. Kuriko was comatose, and unlike her mother, her soul could not wander while her body remained inert. As Emiko had needed a new place to stay after her apartment burned, and Usoko couldn't bear to stay in her own apartment right now, the two had moved into and were sharing the penthouse clubhouse, where all 6 girls had now finally reunited. The first to approach Usoko was Nonami, wrapping her arms tightly around her niece. "I am so sorry, Usako," she whispered. "We will do everything we can for Kuriko. You have my word." "Thank you, Nonami," replied Usako robotically, still feeling numb to everything. She was hurting, badly, and it was clear to see in her features. She hadn't slept for more than a couple hours and days, with large dark circles rimming her eyes. Her hair was an absolute rat's nest of tangles and mess. Her skin was pale and clammy, and she'd probably lost at least 10 pounds from not eating anything. It was Ray who spoke up next, having left Hitomi back at the girls' apartment. They had officially gotten back together while they had been in Ray's dad's village, and were continuing where they'd left off, so to speak. She had hoped to share the good news with all her friends, but Ray knew right now. Usako came first. "Usako, hey, you did all you could. I hear you went super angel on that thing." Usako nodded once, barely. "Ray," she mumbled, "I could really use one of your hugs." Not one to pass up an opportunity for a bear hug, Ray dutifully did as asked, though taking care not to squeeze too tight this time. There was a brief mulling about after that, as everyone caught back up. Usako preferred to stay on the sofa, curled in a ball and hugging her knees. Emiko sat down next to her, laying a hand onto Usako's. "Uso-chan," she whispered and left it. "Uso-chan," she whispered and left it there. The two of them didn't always need words to communicate, and none were needed here. They embraced, and Usako let loose every ounce of pain and sorrow she felt in one ear-splitting wail as she sobbed into Emiko's chest. One by one, her friends all came over and laid either a hand or an embrace of their own on the girl, all of them with glimmers of tears in their own eyes. Kuriko was everyone's friend and was well loved by everyone in the group, which made her current state all the more painful for them. Usako continued crying for another hour, stopping only to start again seconds or minutes later. When it started getting late, Both Rei and Hyoka had to take their leaves, Sarah accompanying Hyoka home at the Yukiona's request. That left only Nonami, Emiko, and Usoko in the living room, the former of whom reached into her bag and pulled a book from it. Usoko, while searching for a different tome back home, I found this one, she explained. It contains a spell I think may be the one you will need to awaken Kuriko. It won't be easy, but if anyone can do this, can learn this spell, it's you. Usoko glanced first at the book, then to Nonami, and for the first time in nearly a week, she smiled. A small one, and one that still held much sorrow, but it was a smile nonetheless. Thank you, Aunt Maria, she said, and meant every word of it. Elizabeth Kosaka, upon her return to Fumizaki, had been released from custody as promised. Immediately, she had made her way to a nearby parking garage, where she met with a shadowy figure. So she has indeed achieved Seraphim? They asked. Elizabeth nodded. That's the only thing it could be. I've seen her fallen form, when my skeletal minions nearly killed Maria a while back. This is definitely angelic in nature. Then it's as I suspected, replied the figure in... Was it relief? Elizabeth couldn't be too sure. This person had simply sent her a message when she'd arrived back in Fumizaki, requesting this meeting and including a picture of the Dampier's apartment as proof they weren't to be trifled with. Keep an eye on her for me, and if anything darker progresses, tell me at once. Yeah, sure thing, replied Elizabeth, not meaning a word of it. As the Dampier had left, the strange figure walked over to a nearby balcony and pulled the hood of her cowl back, azure hair fluttering down her back. Good, sighed Megami Toriyama, her body relaxing as she looked off into the distance. Maybe there is hope yet. Maybe I won't have to kill Usoko Takibana after all. Pulling her hood back up, she made her way to the back of the structure and into a swirling purple vortex in the wall that opened as she approached, and closed after her once she'd stepped through. Where it led, Elizabeth could not say, but she'd definitely seen it with her own eyes, and was going to keep a closer eye on Megami from now on. She could not be allowed to interfere, not when they were so close. Who are you really, Megami Toriyama? As if that's your real name. And what could you possibly want with Usoko? Epilogue. 5 months ago. It was 3 in the morning when Emiko's phone went off. A call from Lydia. And this early? That couldn't be good. Yes, ma'am, she asked, doing her best to sound professional, despite her freshly awoken state. What do you need? Is everything all right? Usoko? Yes, everything is fine, Ms. Ayame, replied Lydia softly, but we need you to come down to Gardner as fast as you can. There's been a development in your case. Emiko couldn't be sure if this development was a good thing or a bad thing from Lydia's tone, but just the same, she nodded. I'll be there within 15 minutes, she said before the call ended. There wasn't much time to dress herself, and she was currently only wearing a silk nightgown, so she quickly threw on a jacket and a pair of black sweats. Before she left, though, she grabbed hold of the stuffed turtle Usoko had given her when they were kids. Small enough to fit in the Oni's jacket pocket, the turtle would be there to provide a welcome sense of comfort, no matter what she was about to face. Within minutes she arrived, and had she thought to glance down as she flew over Maku Park, she'd have seen Usoko on one of her early morning jogs. As it was, she'd been too preoccupied with thoughts rushing through her head to concentrate on anything but making it to HQ as soon as possible. Upon touching down and turning visible, she was greeted by Lydia and Nonami, both of whom seemed pleased to see her. Okay, that was probably a good sign, thought Emiko. If there was something serious going on, she doubted either of them would be smiling. Princess Iomea, said Nonami, addressing Emiko with her proper title. Thank you for coming. As Lydia had previously stated, there has been an update on the case against you. Nonami then deferred to Lydia, who held out an official-looking form for the Oni to read over. Upon careful consideration of the council, of the more than extraordinary circumstances of your condition, it has been decided that you will not be charged with any of the charges filed. In exchange, however, you will be required to serve a year with Gardner as an agent. You are also being tasked with finding the true killer behind the remaining 3 murders. We know it has to be a blue Oni from the claws. Nonami winked at Emmy before yawning. Don't worry, it's not going to be too bad. You're being assigned to my unit. In fact, the others should be here soon to go over all of that. If you wouldn't mind waiting out here for a moment while Lydia and I go over a few details, we'll call you in when it's time. Filled with relief, Emiko sat down and mulled over everything she'd just been told. She was essentially being exonerated, despite the fact her hands had been the ones to... She shook her head rapidly. No, it might have been her hands, but it wasn't her. She reached into her pocket, pulling the turtle out and hugging it tight to her. A year with Gardner, huh? That wouldn't be so bad. And working with Usoko. Maybe she'd finally be able to confess her feelings to the girl. She'd known since June that her feelings of friendship towards the Pinkette had evolved into something else. But Emiko wasn't even completely sure herself. So caught up in her thinking was she, that she didn't even notice either the very girl that was on her mind walking right past her, or the banshee that had been coaching her. However, she did notice when Rei Kobayashi was practically dragging her half-awake self through the doors of HQ and decided to follow close behind her. It was time to turn the page on her life, and Emiko Ayame was going to see it through with Usoko and the others by her side. She could feel it. And that is the end of Isolated Waters. So, what did you think? Initially, I'm not gonna lie, when I wrote the Kuriko scene, I kind of almost intended for her to stay dead. But I thought, no, that's just too mean. So, I worked out a happy little medium with the comatose thing. But, yeah, that's the 4th book. I'm going to need to go over this and fix some typos, because I noticed quite a few towards the end. I hope you enjoyed this. This would be the end of what will be the published book 2, or the end of the second, or maybe the 3rd patch, DLC of the visual novel. Probably patch, I'd imagine. Yeah. But, yeah. There's going to be a bigger pause before we get to book 5, simply for the fact that the chapters are still uploading to the Discord server. So, So, yeah, that's the thing. But once those are uploaded, we'll start book 5. Maybe I'll do a little teaser. I don't know. Probably not. But who knows? I like recording these. It's fun. So, who knows? We'll see. But for now, yeah, I guess if you got any theories about Midori or what's gonna happen next, definitely put them down, because, like I said, book 5's already been written. But I'm curious, who do you think Midori really is? If it's not obvious. But, yeah, until the next time, I hope you enjoyed. This has been Book 4 of the Yokai, Book 4, Isolated Waters. And I've been your author and reader, Reiko Ayanami. Until we meet again, Take care, stay healthy, and sayonara.